How essential to Augustine's thinking is slavery? Hey, I'm Jordan, and this is the Bible and Archaeology podcast, the place for conversations and questions about the lands, civilizations, and archaeology of the Bible. This week, I'm joined by Dr. Toni Alimi for a conversation about his new book, Slaves of God, in which he takes on this question, looking at the systems and thought about slavery within the work of Augustine. You might be surprised to find out just how essential to his thinking slavery was. We're going to walk through some of the Roman systems that influenced this, as well as the thinking and writing of Augustine. I really recommend the book. It gets into this in detail, and I hope that this podcast gives you a nice overview of that book. Remember, for early access to ad-free video podcasts and exclusive bonus content, you can join us over on Patreon. We are Bible and Arc on Patreon. So settle in, and I hope you enjoy our conversation about slavery in the thinking of Augustine. Dr. Alimi, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk about your new book, Slaves of God. I really enjoyed reading it. I really appreciate you taking the time because this is a topic, I have to say, I haven't really thought about before. So thank you for coming in to shed some more light on this.
Thanks so much for having me, Jordan. I'm really excited to be here.
If we can, I'd like to start with the title itself, because I think this is a phrase people have heard before, largely. If you're coming from a church context, if you know your Bible, if you know Augustine, you've heard this phrase before. So can we start there? Because it's a great title. It's catchy. How did you end up at that title? And if I can tag on to why that title? How did you get there and why?
Yeah, thanks. I wish I could take credit for the title. I can't. It was my teacher, Jeffrey Stout, who suggested it. And I'm glad he did, because I'm useless at titles. But I think I hope it's an apt title for at least the following reason. So for Augustine, to be a slave of God means that you radically depend on God for your existence. And in fact, Augustine thought that all creation is, in an important sense, a slave of God for this reason, because all creation depends on God for its existence. So Augustine thought that God creates and sustains everything, including us. So he says, we are slaves of God because we are creatures. So that's the first thing I think it signals. The second thing it's supposed to signal is closely related. So Augustine thought that because we radically depend on God for our existence, all humans owe God worship and faithful service. And in fact, when Augustine is trying to translate the Greek word latreia into Latin, the New Testament word latreia into Latin, he will go back and forth, not sure whether to translate the term as cultus, which we might translate into English as worship, or servitus, which we might translate into English as slavery. So he goes back and forth between these two, kind of suggesting that for him, they're deeply conceptually related. So all humans owe God both worship and a kind of faithful service, and that's part of what it is to be a slave. So he says that humans who fail to worship God are fugitives. They're slaves on the run. So a lot of Christian theologians have thought these first two things, that all creatures depend on God for their existence, and everyone, or all humans at least, have an obligation to worship God. But in the book, I argue that there's this third feature of slavery to God that is maybe more particular to Augustine or more peculiar to Augustine. And it's that he thought that God is entitled to rule humans unaccountably and violently. And because he can rule unaccountably, God doesn't owe us an explanation of how he treats us. And because he can rule us violently, God sort of permissibly, violently coerces us. In fact, Augustine believed God does this all the time. So in a commentary on the Psalms, he says, all your life on earth is your beating. So cry out to the hand that beats you, have mercy on us, O Master, have mercy. So that's why the book title is Slaves of God.
In between those three things, is this call to be a slave to God, like, a central element to his thinking? Does that stand out like naturally, or is this something as you're coming through this and finding this framework that kind of emerged as actually this runs through a lot more of the thinking than maybe has previously been identified?
Yeah, it's a great question. So one of the analogies I like to use is, if you remember the old story about the fish who are swimming through the water, and it's these two young fish, and then an older fish comes along and says, "How's the water?" And the two fish say to one another, "Wait, what's water?" So it's everywhere around them, and precisely because it's everywhere, they don't notice it. And I think that's kind of how the concept of slavery, and even more particularly the notion of slavery to God, is in Augustine's thought. Once you start looking for it, it's everywhere. But precisely because it's everywhere, it's actually really easy to miss. One way that it's sometimes missed is that English translations of Augustine's texts have often translated servus as servant, and dominus as Lord, and servitus as servitude. But of course, they're just as well translated as slave, master, and slavery, respectively. And so, in fact, what we have to do is go sort of dig into the details in each case and see whether what Augustine is doing with the term or the concept is sort of more precisely maps on to our modern conception of slavery, or whether it more precisely maps on to a modern conception of mastery. And in fact, one of the things I argue in the book is that a lot of the time, what Augustine is describing really more precisely maps on to our concepts of master and slavery than maybe lordship and servitude. So the example of God's rule, I think, is a useful one, right? Mm-hmm. Augustine thinks that it's fitting for God to use his position as our master to violently coerce us back into divine service. That sounds to me a lot more like what a modern English speaker might call slavery than what a modern English speaker might call servitude. And then, of course, or I shouldn't say of course, but one of the things I argue in the book is that Augustine's account of chattel slavery is also intimately connected to this. So what God does is he uses his position to coerce us. And one of the punishments, the coercive punishments he uses, is giving some people up to be chattel slaves. So God ordains some people as masters over the chattel slaves so that masters can help their slaves return to faithful slavery to God. So there's more to the story than this, but you can already see kind of the tight connection between slavery to God and chattel slavery just in that moment in the argument.
Can I ask on the concept of the chattel slavery, and I think some of the water in which, that the texts you are swimming in, but also that he was living in, can you say a little bit about what slavery looked like in the world that he lived, and how some of these concepts like chattel slavery appeared to him and may have influenced how he thought about this?
Yeah, that's great. And it's crucial to making that clear if we're going to avoid the problem of anachronism, right? Because it would be a mistake to just assume that what Augustine is talking about looks like, for example, what a modern American or English reader might imagine with Atlantic slavery. What we have to do is fill out the details of the institution as Augustine would have encountered it. So here are some features of the institution that Augustine would have encountered. So slavery was a crucial aspect of the Roman economy and social life for much of Rome's history. Around Augustine's day, we should think of maybe 10 to 15% roughly of the Roman population as enslaved. Okay. Now these figures they're not gonna be precise. It's impossible to get a ton of precision. So think of it more like on the order of magnitude than as a precise figure. But even if we think of it just on the order of magnitude, what we're talking about is millions of enslaved people. Okay, a slave was property, human property, and a source for labor. So some large wealthy landowners would depend on slaves for agricultural labor, but slaves were even more commonly found in the domestic context. So here they're running the house, taking care of children, waiting on their masters and mistresses. They're not exclusively used for what today we might call unskilled labor, by which I think people mean jobs for which you require no formal education. So unlike in the antebellum United States, where many slave states made it illegal to educate slaves, in ancient Rome, many slaves were doctors and accountants, architects, business managers. So they weren't assumed to be subhuman or anything like that. And yet, their legal status meant that they were dominated. So they lacked the rights of citizenship. They couldn't vote. They couldn't even bring a complaint, legally speaking, against their masters. And indeed, their testimony in court was considered inherently untrustworthy. Mm. And so what that meant is that they lacked an important instrument of social power to contend with their master's mistreatment. And indeed, they were often beaten, whipped, and sexually abused. Augustine knew all of this, which is one reason he spends so much time exhorting slaves not to mistreat, or exhorting masters not to mistreat their slaves, because he knows that that masters were often or tended to do that. Augustine, I should just say, grew up in a household with slaves. So his father, Patricius, owned some slaves, and Augustine saw the violence that they were exposed to firsthand. There's an episode in Confessions 9 where Patricius finds out that his slaves have been gossiping about Augustine's mother, Patricius's wife, Monica, behind her back. And he beats them violently as a punishment for what they had done. So Augustine tells us this, which means that Augustine knew of it. And, I mean, almost certainly knew of it firsthand. He probably witnessed it or heard about it soon after it happened. And later in life, as a priest and bishop, some of Augustine's parishioners were slave owners too. Undoubtedly, he knew that some of them were violently beating or whipping their slaves. And he probably knew that some of them were at least given to or thought it permissible to violate their slaves sexually as well. So this is all in the background of what Augustine is talking about when he's talking about the institution of chattel slavery.
You say in the book that, right, Augustine got slavery wrong. He inferred from his belief that slavery is God's just punishment of sin, that it's not inherently unjust. And yet he got it wrong. But we also have him saying, that God can use coercive force. And then we have him saying, masters, treat your slaves in this way. How do we come to a place to try to balance his view? Like, can you say a little bit about how he can have it wrong, but also you say he's morally ignorant, I guess, because of that context? Like, the balance of that for us feels very hard. Like, when I'm reading through your book, that was a difficult thing to see. I can see how you're laying out his context and where he follows in with that, but then also where he goes against it. And then where do we go from there?
Yeah, thanks. So I think that you're exactly right that this is one of the main tensions that the book is trying to take really seriously. To us, to most of modern readers, it's obvious that slavery is wrong, morally wrong, I mean. And for Augustine, it's just not obvious that's true. Indeed, for Augustine, it almost seems to be the case that the opposite is true. Augustine doesn't think he's encountered any sort of really successful arguments against chattel slavery. Now, whether Augustine is entitled to that judgment is not for me to decide, but that seems to be the kind of basic disposition that he brings to every discussion of chattel slavery with which he engages. Now, Augustine, of course, as you know, has been remarkably influential all over theology, philosophy, political thought, classics or modern reception of classical studies, medieval thought. His fingerprints are everywhere, and they're everywhere in part because Augustine was for all of his flaws, remarkably brilliant and creative thinker. And so what the problem that raises for us as modern readers of Augustine is, how could someone so clever have gotten something that seems to us so obvious wrong? And what the book is trying to do is lay out the reasons, lay out the case. Of course, not to say that that Augustine is justified or exculpated or right. He isn't right. He's wrong. Mm-hmm. But what are his reasons that would make it make his mistake intelligible to us, if it could be intelligible to us? If we understand his reasons, then we might be able to at least sort of get a better sense of how he could be guilty of this. Well, I don't know if I want to use the word guilty, but how he could be morally ignorant in this way.
It feels like a tightrope that you walk through this book as you try to engage with these things and where does he fall in this system. And I guess to complicate things a little bit more for the listener and some of this background that I think is helpful that you go through, we have the Roman system of the enslavement system in the Roman Empire, but you also talk through some of these thinkers and the legal system that you draw a line between how he is using or repurposing. Can you say a little bit about how that further complicates his position and culpability or not in how he comes to the thinking that he has?
Yeah, so good. So one of the ways to enter this is to think of three commitments that Augustine brings to the table when he's talking about chattel slavery. So the first one we've already discussed, the idea that all humans are slaves of God. The second commitment that's implicit in what Augustine believed about chattel slavery is that chattel slavery is not inherently morally bad or wrong. And then the third is that chattel slavery can be beneficial. So these three commitments, I think, run through his every discussion he has about the institution of chattel slavery. And each of them, I argue in the book, is due to some earlier Roman thinker. So the idea that everyone is a slave of God, Augustine seems to have gotten, or at least could have gotten, from an earlier Christian thinker named Lactantius. Lactantius, like Augustine, was a North African convert to Christianity. Like Augustine, he was a rhetorician. Lactantius lived from around 250 CE to around 325 CE. And he wrote under the conditions of the Diocletian persecution against Christians. And in Lactantius's writings, one theme sort of comes out that humans and indeed all creatures, I suppose, are only have one master, and that master is God. And indeed, Lactantius seems to think that this is a problem for certain kinds of subordination or hierarchy, because interhuman subordination hierarchy maybe fail to respect the kind of equality that we all have as God's slaves, and respect that God alone is our master, right? Mm-hmm. So Augustine doesn't take on the sort of subordination, maybe wrong stuff, but he does take on the all humans are slaves of God stuff from Lactantius. From Seneca, who was a Stoic writing in the 1st century CE, Augustine seems to borrow the idea that chattel slavery is not inherently wrong. So Seneca thinks this because Seneca, as a Stoic, believes that something is inherently bad only if it can make a person bad. And he just looks at master-slave relationships and he says, look, sometimes you look at a master-slave relationship and the virtuous person is the slave and the vicious person is the master. Sometimes masters are sort of lazy and incontinent, and slaves sometimes are remarkably self-controlled and temperate. And so he concludes mastery cannot be inherently good and slavery cannot be inherently bad, because what matters is the state of your soul. And being a master doesn't help your soul necessarily, and being a slave doesn't hurt your soul necessarily. And Augustine seems to think that's right, or something like that is right. So he translates the Senecan commitment slightly. Rather than what Seneca would describe as sort of slavery to external things being what's inherently bad. What Augustine says is it's slavery to sin. That's what's inherently bad. Why? Because if you're a slave of sin, you really necessarily are morally corrupted by your enslavement. And then from Cicero, who was writing in the 1st century BCE, Augustine gets the commitment that chattel slavery is not, or chattel slavery can benefit slaves. Now, it's actually not clear that Cicero believed this or said it. He may have said it, but the text of On the Republic, which is where Augustine is supposedly getting the commitment that we have today, all versions of the text we have today lack the quote that Augustine is attributing to Cicero. So he may be right, and indeed there is some corroborating evidence from Nonius that Nonius attributes to Cicero a similar commitment, and what we think would be a similar part of Book 3 of Cicero's On the Commonwealth. But we don't have sort of the direct evidence to corroborate Augustine's citation. But what Augustine takes from Cicero, legitimately or not, is the idea that chattel slavery can be beneficial. So now if we put all 3 of these commitments together, so first, everyone's a slave of God. Second, chattel slavery is not inherently bad or wrong. And third, that chattel slavery can be beneficial. Here's what we get. God, as our master, is entitled to discipline and punish us. Okay. One punishment he chooses is chattel slavery, and the purpose of the punishment is to bring us back to faithful service to God. It'd be really bad if chattel slavery were inherently bad, because then it would seem like God is enjoining something that's inherently wrong, but he doesn't. But it's not a problem because it turns out, for Senecan reasons, that chattel slavery is not inherently bad or wrong. But you might want something more. You want God to not just fail to do bad things. You want God to also do good things. And the third commitment that chattel slavery can be beneficial helps secure that condition, because it turns out that God is not just punishing us arbitrarily, but he's actually picking sort of good punishments that would be useful. And that's where the Ciceronian commitment, or the so-called Ciceronian commitment, that chattel slavery can be beneficial, comes in. So once we put all 3 of those commitments together, now we have a sense for why Augustine sort of thinks that chattel slavery is legitimately instituted by God as a punishment for helping those who have run away come back into God's faithful service.
Right. Yeah, the position of God there as, I guess, the slave master of everyone, it does create, significant problem if the system itself is bad for what it is saying about that order. Within the all humans and that the acceptance of this system, is there anything said about the position of Christians within the system? Are they more deserving in his view of being masters, or should they be slaves to benefit, or is it anyone can fall in any layer of this system?
Great. So in City of God 19, books 15 and 16, Augustine lays out the story of how slavery enters, and what he says, or how chattel slavery enters the world. And what he says is that the first cause of chattel slavery is sin. And so you might infer from this that if sin is the problem that chattel slavery is meant to solve, then only people who are in the grip of sin should be chattel slaves. And indeed, if the purpose of chattel slavery is to help slaves become Christian, then maybe masters should be Christians and not non-Christians, right? You might think, well, how is a non-Christian going to help their slave become a Christian if they themselves aren't Christian, right? And in fact, Augustine doesn't say that. I think this is one of the kind of deep confusions in his account, or at least one of the lacunae in his account, a problem that he leaves sort of painfully unresolved. Now, in the book, one thing I do is I sort of offer him a solution to the problem, but it's a rather complicated solution. It requires us to go into a lot of details about Augustine's account of the law. And it's necessarily speculative because it's an answer that Augustine didn't give. The really short version of the solution is this. It's that Augustine thought that, I argue about the law, Augustine thought that even laws given by non-Christians can help Christians love God better, even if they don't do so perfectly. So you might hope that laws would be given by Christians, but you don't need the law to be given by a Christian for it to be beneficial, and you don't need the law to be given to a non-Christian for it to be beneficial. The sort of most difficult case where a non-Christian is giving a Christian a law could still benefit a Christian. And so if that is Augustine's account of civil law, which is the view that I argue for in the book, then maybe you can sort of draw an analogy with slavery where the master is helping the slave, even a non-Christian master is helping a Christian slave move closer towards God in a kind of indirect manner by issuing the relevantly useful sorts of commands. As I said, that's necessarily speculative because Augustine doesn't give us the answer to this question, and it's really frustrating and confusing that he doesn't. But that's sort of my best effort to solve what I take to be a really deep problem for him.
So did Augustine just think that slavery was permissible, or does his thinking, does his framework, do his systems lead him to see it actually as more of a good? Because we've talked through some of this and how it can be beneficial in a spiritual way, or it can help one to another. So if we're using that term good, I guess, is that fair? And how would you define what that good looks like for him?
Yeah, thanks for that. So as I said earlier, I think Augustine's account of slavery, he says that slavery is caused by sin. And Augustine's readers have sometimes inferred from this that chattel slavery is bad or wrong. And you can see why someone might make this inference, right? So if chattel slavery results from sin, doesn't that make it somehow deficient? So I understand the inference, but I don't think it's quite right. I think what you're suggesting in your question, that it's good, is closer to the truth. So the analogy that I like to use is to illness and medicine. So imagine a perfect world. In a perfect world, there's no illness. And in such a world, therefore, there would be no medicine. And so we should say that in a perfect world, there is no medicine. But no one thinks, or maybe very few people think, that this implies that medicine is inherently bad, wrong, or deficient. Of course, some medicines are bad, some are dangerous, some are abused easily, some are misapplied, doctors misprescribe, overprescribe, patients fail to take their medicines, take them improperly. All of these are problems with medicine, but they're not inherent, I think, to medicine, such that it makes medicine inherently bad. Instead, we should think of medicine as a corruptible good. It's a good thing solving a real problem that can be misused or abused. And I think that's how Augustine viewed chattel slavery, or at least he viewed it in a similar light. Chattel slavery results from sin, and in this sense, it reflects the world's imperfection, and it can be abused. But that doesn't make it inherently bad or wrong. Indeed, I think Augustine's view is that it is, or it can be, very useful. It can serve a significant theological purpose.
Could I ask a follow-up question on some of the problem between these systems in needing to identify things as good or potentially good because of the divine involvement? Is there no division between this like divine or spiritual slavery and the literal physical slavery in his thinking? Like, do they map onto each other in a way, or as the system develops over time for him, do distinctions start to emerge between how he thinks about those, and so something can be permissible in one and not in another?
Great. So I think one way we can put the question is, in which ways does chattel slavery mirror the divine order in Augustine's account, and in which ways does it not? So here are a few ways that we get a mirroring. Here's one way we don't get a mirroring. Let me start with that because that's where Augustine starts. Augustine thinks that humans fell from their originally created order, which was ordained by God, when Adam and Eve sinned in the Garden of Eden. In the garden, he said, in our originally created state, there actually was no chattel slavery, and there would be no chattel slavery. That's not how God intended things as sort of a first intention of creation. God did not originally create humans to be masters over one another. But after the fall, slavery becomes a means or a mechanism that God uses to compel fugitives, that is, those people who don't worship God, back into divine service. And so in this sense, the very fact of slavery in the world, the fact of chattel slavery in the world, does reflect God's providential ordering of things, God's providential intention. I think, moreover, that Augustine wanted human masters to sort of think of their duties to their slaves under the aspect of their duties to God, who is their heavenly master. So Augustine, for example, in a sermon, I believe it's Sermon 94, he's riffing on this passage in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus tells a story of three slaves who have been entrusted a certain amount of money by their master while the master goes on a long trip. And to one, the master entrusts 5 sums of money, to another 2 sums of money, and to the third 1 sum of money. And after the master returns, the first 2 servants have doubled the amount of money that the master gives them. So the one who was given 5 now has 10, and the one who was given 2 now has 4. But the third servant, maybe out of fear or anxiety about the master, maybe a worry about a risk of losing the money that the master entrusted him, has not produced any profit. And so the master says to the first 2 slaves, "Well done, my good and faithful slave." And then to the third slave, he calls him sort of wicked and unprofitable or something like that. And Augustine says to the people in his congregation preaching the sermon, if you want to be like the first 2 slaves, be responsible with the valuable things that God has entrusted to you. Now, what has God entrusted to you as head of your household? He's entrusted you to care of the souls of those who are in your household. That is to say, he's entrusted to you care of your wife, care of your children, and care of your slaves, care of their souls. Those are the sums of money, so to speak, that your master, your heavenly master, is entrusting to you as a father, as a husband, and as an earthly master. And so if you want to be profitable, Augustine says, make sure that the souls of those in your care are improved by your care. That's the way to be profitable. So he wants Christian masters to understand their duties as masters under the aspect of their own slavery to God. They're slaves. The people underneath them are slaves of slaves. That is, servi vicarii, which is a sort of a common feature of Roman slavery. And the way to be a responsible slave of God is to be a responsible master of the slaves that God has entrusted unto you. So this is an important way, I think, in which the 2 institutions, divine slavery and chattel slavery, are meant to mirror one another.
You've used, as we're talking through this, the terms of slave and master keep appearing here. And this is something you talk about in the book with the translation of how we come to these phrases in his writing, but also in some of the writings that he is talking about, can complicate or sometimes push down specific readings. So can you say a little bit about how you came to the language that you use in this book and the language that you feel like, in order to understand the water in which he's swimming, that it is everywhere, how those words need to come in? Because I think that leads to some of the questions of his influence to today as well, of how we are continuing to still read him or find his influence in things, or where we don't, depending on how these phrases get translated.
Yeah, that's really useful. So as I mentioned earlier, there has sometimes been a tendency in Augustine studies or in translations of Augustine's text to translate servus as servant and dominus as Lord. And sometimes that is legitimate. So for instance, when Augustine is citing the Hebrew and Christian scriptures. He's one of the word that is most often translated into English as Lord in his Latin Bible is Dominus. So Dominus could be in English master or Lord, but at least sometimes when Augustine is referring to Dominus, he's plausibly referring to something that we would think of as a Lord. How do I know we would think of it? Because most English Bibles translate the same term as Lord, right? So sometimes it's perfectly legitimate to translate things as Lord. Sarah Rudin, who translated the Confessions in 2017, sort of caused a splash by translating Dominus, at least in much of the Confessions, if not all of it, as master, and translating servus throughout as slave rather than servant. So here's the effect of her translation on the very first line of the Confessions. So if you look at most translations of the Confessions, the very first line reads something like, great and mighty are you, Lord, and great is your name, Lord, and greatly to be praised, or great and mighty are you, Lord, and greatly to be praised. And that's clearly a reference to the Psalms, which sort of repeat this refrain. Rudin's translation is, you are a great and powerful master, and to be praised in a loud voice, something like that. I haven't gotten the translations exactly right, but this gives the feel. And it's a stark translation difference, one that sort of disrupts someone who is used to the sort of more traditional translations of the Confessions. But I think it's one that's vindicated. And the way to vindicate it, I think, is to look at how Augustine uses the term servus in various contexts, as well as the terms dominus and servitus. And so what I said earlier about what the institution of what we would call chattel slavery looked like in the Roman context, I think gives us good reasons to go in for translating servus as slave when Augustine is talking about the interhuman relationships, right? So almost, for example, in the Confessions, when Augustine is talking about Patricius violently beating his servi because they badmouthed Monica, Augustine understands that this is a relationship where one person owns the other as property by law, where the person owned as property is unable to contend with the person who owns them, and where, as a result, the person who is owned is subject to violence on behalf of the person who owns them. To me, it's just clear that we should translate that as slave rather than servant.
Yeah.
What about the divine human case? So the most stark case of this, I think, is Augustine's commentary on Psalm 122. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but here's what Augustine says. He says, when Adam fell, Adam was cast out of paradise like a spider. And that is when Adam's whipping began. And then he says, all humans are whipped in Adam, or Adam is whipped in all humans. All your life on earth is your whipping. Some people don't realize that they're being whipped. They've become so dulled to the lacerations that they don't realize that it's true. But all of us, all the time, are being whipped in Adam. And that's why he then says, cry out to the hand that beats you, have mercy on us. O Dominus, have mercy. Now we could translate this as Lord. It's not necessarily a mistake. Indeed, because Augustine is citing the Psalms, there's something sensible in translating it as Lord. But I think there's something we miss, or something we're inclined to miss if we don't notice that Augustine's repeated referral to the image of the whip and the exercise of the whip by one against another is the paradigmatic Roman symbol for the institution of chattel slavery. And so when Augustine is referring to God as whipping us humans, his creation, it seems to me that we should, at least we need very strong reasons to resist the translation of this relationship, translation of the name of this relationship as slavery. Because what else could he mean
Yeah.
He's by referring to God's treatment of humans as one of constant whipping, one in which the person being whipped must cry out to the one who whips them, "Have mercy on us." So that's why I think it's legitimate to translate dominus and servus in contexts such as these as master and slave.
Is it possible, I feel like it's a large question, but is it possible to gauge the scope of influence that his thinking on slavery and his integration of this system and his hierarchies and his defense of this into all of his writings, if it becomes the water in which he swims, can we see the scope of his influence across time into the thinking of other individuals, whether they be later Christian writers or not, into this system of slavery?
Yeah, so my colleague Matt Aliyah, who teaches at St. Louis University, has found several American pro-slavery writers who explicitly appealed to the authority of Augustine as part of their defenses of slavery in the American antebellum context. And so he details some of these examples in his book, The Problem of the Christian Master. I mentioned earlier that Augustine's account of slavery has this lacuna about what to do with the Christian slave and the non-Christian master. And I argue in the book that Atlantic's pro-slavers bumped up against this lacuna, and the way they resolved it actually is sort of meaningfully important for our understanding of Atlantic slavery. So here's the problem. If chattel slavery is ordained by God to help masters become slaves, as Augustine tells us it is in City of God 19, and then you might think, well, there's no reason to enslave someone if they're a Christian. And so what we find in the 17th century in some English colonies, so in Barbados, in Maryland, and in Virginia, we see a justification of the practice of enslaving Africans on the grounds that Africans are non-Christians. But in the late 17th century, Quaker missionaries start evangelizing slaves. The slaves are being baptized. And this is going to be a problem for the institution of slavery, because if the only justification, or if the central justification for enslaving Africans is that they're non-Christian, once they start converting, one loses all rational justification for enslaving them. And so in the late 17th century and into the 18th century, we start to see English colonial justifications of slavery shift to racial justifications. So the Augustinian reasoning, I argue, was at play in the earlier justifications, but its limits, the lacuna that Augustine left unresolved, seem to have been part of the rationale for a shift towards a racialization of slavery in some English colonial law. So here, a problem for Augustine, or a problem of Augustine's account, ends up getting resolved in a way that, as I think is obvious, remains meaningful for all who are influenced by racialization in English colonial and therefore American common law. I do just want to emphasize that Augustine's position, his reasoning from the premise that humans are slaves of God to the conclusion that chattel slavery is permissible, was not the only way that early Christians thought about slavery. So I mentioned Lactantius earlier, and in addition to him, Gregory of Nyssa also thought that humans are slaves of God, but each of them thought that this militates against chattel slavery. There seem to have been two ideas at play. First, that because humans are slaves of God, enslaving another human sort of robs God of God's property. And second, because humans are slaves of God, we're all equal to one another, and enslaving another person fails to respect this equality. But Augustine's view that slavery to God in no way counts against chattel slavery does seem to have become the dominant one in much medieval and early modern thought concerning slavery. So it wasn't the only view, but it does seem to have become the dominant view. So there's a Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century great Catholic theologian, is commenting on the New Testament epistle of Titus. And so in Titus chapter 2, verse 9, the writer says that slaves should be subject to their masters. And Aquinas asks the question, sort of to prompt the following discourse in the commentary: why is it that the New Testament epistle writers keep saying this? Because Aquinas has seen it in 1 Corinthians, he's seen it in Ephesians, he's seen it in 1 Peter, and he's seeing it in Titus. Why, and in Colossians, why in the world do the New Testament writers keep having to say slaves be subject to their masters? Isn't it obvious that this should be so? And Aquinas resolves this puzzle by supposing that there was an early Jewish heresy that taught, and I quote Aquinas' words, that slaves of God ought not to serve men, unquote. So that's Aquinas' view, that there's this early Jewish heresy. Aquinas didn't need to look to Judaism to find the so-called heresy. We can talk about his reasons for blaming Judaism for this so-called problem. Lactantius and Gregory of Nyssa affirmed something like it. So Aquinas' response to the so-called heresy is that, quote, Christ did not come by faith to remove the order of justice. Rather, the order of justice is preserved by the faith of Christ. Justice requires that some are subject to others, though this kind of slavery pertains only to the body, unquote. That's not too distant from, and it's easy to hear Augustine echoed here, because if we think about Augustine's commentary on Psalm 124, he writes, Christ did not come to make slaves free, but to make bad slaves good. So this is a case where sort of one of the greatest and most influential medieval Christian theologians is sort of taking what seems to be the Augustinian account on board and using it to resolve what he thinks to be, or what he takes to be, sort of an interpretive problem that the New Testament raises for him.
Given the scope of his thought and the length to which his thought has held sway and had influence, should modern readers or listeners that are coming to this and thinking, maybe I've never thought about this before, I've never realized how much this is in all of his thought and the influence that it had, should they try to in some way hold Augustine accountable? Is there a way to hold Augustine accountable, or is that missing the point and there's actually something else that attention should be spent on?
Yeah, I don't know how we could hold Augustine accountable. He isn't around for us to blame him or censure him. I think sometimes when we talk about holding figures in the past accountable, what we want is a kind of sort of final judgment where we sort of have on the ledger the goods and the bads, and we decide, yes, this person is morally culpable, or no, this person is not morally culpable. And I just, for my own part, think that such judgments, if they need to be made at all, should be left up to someone who has all of the relevant information and knows all of the relevant moral facts. So in some parts of the Christian tradition, this is what God does on the last day with respect to all of us, right? So I don't think I'm not in a position to make such a judgment about anyone, including Augustine. And I think that's what we want, in fact, when we're asking, should we blame Augustine or judge him blameworthy or culpable or something like that. So instead, I prefer to think of holding ourselves accountable for our use of Augustine. So one thing I try to do in the book is identify some of the ways that Augustine's commitments concerning slavery are entangled with other parts of his thought. And I focus on his religion, his moral, and his political thought. We can be more discerning, I think, about how we engage with Augustine, not minimizing the role of slavery in his thought, but taking it as seriously as he did. And I hope that by kind of bringing these entanglements in Augustine's thought to the surface, I'm making it easier for modern readers of Augustine to kind of be more discerning about how we read him. And I also hope that we can start to think more critically about what the medieval and early modern inheritances of Augustine did for post-Augustinian Christian thought and practice around slavery. So I've mentioned two in my earlier answer to you, but I also think there's just so much more work to be done given the kind of breadth and significance of Augustine's influence on medieval and early modern thought. So to the extent that some of us in modernity have inherited Augustinian ways of thinking about God or religion or law or rule or citizenship, and my colleague Matt Elia has also argued pilgrimage, humility, time. So to the extent that these remain part of the way some of us in modernity think about any of these topics, then we may have to discern whether our ways of thinking on these topics reproduce the same kinds of habits of thought that undergird Augustine's justifications of slavery. And if they do, that may give some of us reasons to reconsider our endorsements of some of these positions. So these are ways, I think, of holding ourselves accountable for our use of Augustine. And I suppose my hope is that this might be a more productive way of thinking about these things than asking whether or even how we could hold Augustine accountable.
Dr. Alimi, thank you for your time. I think that's a wonderful place to leave people for today. I'd say until they go and pick up a copy of your book, right? The book is Slaves of God. There's a link to it down below. If you are interested in this, it is a fascinating read. It will challenge you in how you are thinking through some of this, and it will go into much deeper depths as well. So if you are interested, go check it out. It is worth your time. Dr. Alimi, thank you so much for coming through. I really appreciated your book. I think that this is, as you said, one of these things that it's the water that's everywhere. And I can say I hadn't quite realized how much it was through all of his stuff. So thank you for your work on this.
That means a lot to me. Thank you, Jordan. And thanks for the chance to be here and chat.
For everyone listening, thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to like and subscribe wherever you find us. It helps us. Hopefully it helps you stay in touch with us. But for this week, that's all we have. For all of us here at Bible and Archaeology, I'm Jordan. Until next time.